Okay, let's dive in. Clinical trials. I mean, they're absolutely fundamental, the bedrock of modern medicine, really.
They absolutely are. Everything from treatments to big healthcare decisions, it all comes back to them.
But, what happens when that foundation feels a bit shaky? You hear these stories about questionable practices, sometimes even data fabrication. How can we trust the results then? The results that affect our health, our family's health?
It's a huge challenge. I mean, the reliability of medical evidence, the stuff that doctors use that shapes guidelines, it all hinges on the integrity of those trials.
Right. If that integrity is iffy, the whole system of evidence-based medicine is, well, at risk.
Exactly.
And it seems like this isn't just a what-if scenario. The source we're digging into today, it talks about a crisis of confidence in clinical trials.
Yeah, it mentions high rates of practices that are, let's say, questionable, maybe
Right.
not deliberate fraud all the time, but definitely not ideal.
And alongside that, more accusations, more retractions because of really serious stuff like faked data.
And the document makes a good point. It's not always someone trying to cheat the system.
Right.
Sometimes it's, honest mistakes, unintentional errors, or maybe the methods were flawed, or researchers just weren't trained well enough in certain areas, or didn't grasp the ethical standards fully.
Or that pressure cooker environment, the pressure to publish.
Definitely that too. But whatever the cause, the result's the same, isn't it? Compromised integrity leads to results you just can't trust.
Yeah. And the paper argues there's been a cap. You've got general guidelines on research integrity, sure, but they're often too broad for something as specific and complex as a randomized clinical trial, the RCT, the gold standard.
Right. Apart from maybe things like the ICH guidelines, which are very specific to pharmaceuticals, there wasn't really one cohesive set of guidelines for all RCTs.
So there was this urgent need for detailed, specific guidance that covers the whole life cycle of a trial.
Precisely, something comprehensive.
So how on earth do you build something like that? This wasn't just a couple of people hashing it out over lunch, I assume.
Oh, definitely not. This consensus statement, it came from the Cairo Consensus Group on Research Integrity, and it was a really rigorous process, multi-step international effort. It's quite science-based in itself, actually.
They pulled together quite a diverse group, didn't they? 30 experts, 15 countries, 5 continents.
Yeah, a real mix. You had trialists, methodologists, ethicists, statisticians, crucially, patient representatives too, people from industry, journal editors. The works, they used a snowball technique to try and make sure they covered expertise across the whole trial lifespan.
Covering all the bases.
Okay,
And they didn't just jump into opinions, right? They looked at evidence first.
that's right. Before drafting recommendations, they synthesized evidence from 55 systematic reviews, specifically about RCT integrity issues. So it was grounded in existing research.
Okay, evidence base established. Then what?
Then they used a modified Delphi process, which, is this structured way to get group consensus. Experts anonymously rate statements over several rounds.
I think they started with over 100 statements.
Yeah, 111 initially. And they got a really high response rate from the experts, nearly 87%, which is great for this kind of thing.
So the surveys helped find common ground. What about the points they didn't agree on?
For those, they met both in person and virtually, centered around a meeting in Cairo to really hash them out, debate the nuances, and finalize the recommendations.
And they used objective methods to decide what counts as consensus.
Yes, things like statistical thresholds, average percent of majority opinions, to add rigor to saying, okay, we agree on this.
And you mentioned patient reps were involved. How deeply?
Right from the start and all the way through. They were part of that core expert group. Their perspective on trust, on what matters to people actually participating in or affected by trials, is just invaluable. The document also points out that some of the reviews they looked at specifically addressed patient involvement.
That feels really important, having that lived experience perspective built in. Okay, so after all that, the evidence review, the surveys, the debates, what did they actually come up with?
They ended up with 81 consolidated recommendations. 81 specific points aimed at boosting integrity across every single stage of an RCT.
Wow, 81. And they grouped these.
Yeah, into 6 main areas: general aspects, design and approval, conduct and monitoring, reporting, post-publication concerns, and then future research.
Okay, let's unpack some of the key recommendations, maybe some that really stand out or might even be a bit surprising. What are the foundational things they highlighted?
Well, a core theme is that integrity needs structure. It doesn't just happen. So they call for explicit, really visible guidelines and policies, but crucially, with implementation plans.
So not just nice words, but a plan to make it happen.
Exactly. And training came up again and again, not just for the lead researchers, but for ethics committees, journal editors, reviewers. Everyone involved needs solid training in research methods and research integrity.
And ethics committees themselves need to be robust.
Yeah, ideally accredited, and their processors should be, as much as possible, harmonized globally. And addressing that pressure point, institutions have a responsibility to actively try and reduce that excessive pressure to publish.
Because that pressure can lead to bad choices.
It really can.
Okay, shifting to the design and approval stage, what stood out there?
Well, one seemingly simple but important one. You need ethics approval, even if you're only using non-identifiable data from people.
Ah, interesting. And consent forms.
This is key for participants.
Yeah.
Informed consent documents should actually be developed with patient and public involvement.
Makes sense. Get input from the people who need to understand it.
And the consent needs to be really clear about how non-identifiable data might be shared or used down the line. Also, trial design needs to think about equality, diversity, inclusion right from the start so the results actually apply to more people.
Good point. And there was a big one about transparency, right?
Yeah.
About registering the trial.
Huge one. Prospective registration, meaning you have to register the trial protocol in a public, open access registry before you recruit your first participant.
Before anyone signs up.
Yes. And they strongly recommend this becomes standard institutional policy. Mandatory, not optional.
That prevents people from changing the plan secretly later on.
Precisely. And that links to the analysis plan, too, the SAP Statistical Analysis Plan.
Right.
That needs to be developed and ideally published early, specifically before the investigators can even look at the trial data.
Again, locking things down beforehand.
Yep. Stops people from, tweaking the analysis after they see what the data looks like, trying to find a positive result.
And all the analyses need to be specified up front. Primary outcomes, secondary, subgroups.
Everything. If you plan to look at it, write it down beforehand. And if you have multiple main outcomes, you need proper statistical methods to handle that, to avoid false positives just by chance. There was apparently some detailed discussion among the experts on the exact evidence for the best way to do that, but the principle is clear.
Okay, design locked, analysis planned. What about when the trial is actually running the conduct phase?
Here, they emphasize needing checks and balances at the trial sites themselves, ways to assess and reduce the risk of integrity breaches happening on the ground.
And fostering a better culture.
Yes, a culture where people feel safe admitting honest mistakes. Unintentional errors happen, right? The goal should be learning from them without blame. This connects back to good training reduce errors, but also handle the unavoidable ones openly.
So less focus on punishment, more on improvement.
Ideally, yes. And during conduct, data needs checking, validating the routine data collection, even checking up on how informed consent is actually being done during audits.
What about oversight committees, like data monitoring committees?
Absolutely crucial. They need to declare any conflicts of interest transparently. Ideally, they should include patient or public reps. Their meeting minutes should be available. And critically, data integrity needs to be explicitly part of their job description.
So they're actively responsible for checking the data quality.
Yes. And things like centralized monitoring, maybe targeted checking of source data rather than trying to check everything, are recommended.
What if a trial needs to stop early?
That decision shouldn't be made lightly or just by the sponsor. An independent committee should be involved.
And any changes to the plan?
Any protocol modification, any change, needs to be logged in the trial registry with the date it happened. Big changes need ethics approval again. No quiet adjustments allowed.
Okay, that covers conduct. Now, reporting. This sounds like another area ripe for transparency rules.
Oh, definitely. Loads of recommendations here. A big one is pushing journals to step up. They need really clear, comprehensive instructions for authors about openness and transparency.
Making it easier to share data and documents.
Yes, using electronic systems to facilitate that. Authors also need to be wary of and avoid predatory journals, the ones that care more about fees than quality control.
And declaring help.
If professional medical writers were involved, that needs to be stated clearly.
And lots of mandatory reporting.
Yes, it's a theme. Mandatory reporting of ethics approval details, informed consent details in the paper, having an independent committee or ethics board confirm the trial ran as planned, specifying who did what authorship contributions, maybe using something standard like the credit taxonomy.
And ideally, Sharing everything.
That's the gold standard they encourage. Submit the original protocol, the SAP, the anonymized dataset, the statistical code, the full results, everything needed for someone else to check the work.
Wow, that's comprehensive.
It is. And conflicts of interest mandatory declaration, not just for authors, but for reviewers and editors too. Journals need transparent ways to handle their own editors' conflicts if an issue arises.
Makes sense. Can't have the referees having conflicts. What about reporting guidelines?
Things like consort for reporting trial results, spirit for protocols following these should be mandatory. Journals should be doing systematic plagiarism checks.
And reporting the messy stuff.
Absolutely. Transparently report errors, deviations from the plan, missing data, how you dealt with it all, no sweeping things under the rug.
Even the language used matters.
Yes, the writing itself needs to avoid hype. No misrepresentation, exaggeration, or distortion. And the discussion section must talk about limitations, including any related to integrity issues or deviations.
Okay, so that's a huge focus on getting it right before publication. But what if problems slip through? Post-publication issues.
The consensus view is pretty clear. If major integrity breaches are found after publication, it means the system failed somewhere earlier.
A failure of peer review or institutional oversight, maybe?
Could be. The focus then shouldn't just be blame. It needs to be about finding the root causes, correcting the scientific record, and importantly, learning collectively so it doesn't happen again.
So journals need to do better pre-publication checks.
Yes, but also, when issues do come up, guidance, like from COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, should emphasize investigator responsibility, but also support for authors, especially protecting honest authors from unfair attacks or harassment.
That's a tricky balance. Supporting whistleblowers and the accused authors.
Equally, they say, institutions and journals should support both during investigations, and authors absolutely must respond if journals or, say, systematic reviewers ask for explanations about discrepancies in their work.
And they need the records to back it up.
Exactly. Authors are responsible for keeping detailed records, the original protocol, approvals, registry info, the anonymized raw data, the randomization sequence, SAP code, results, and providing them if a post-publication claim requires it.
Yeah, and even whistleblowers should declare conflicts.
Yes, for full transparency of the whole process. If honest errors are found, publish an erratum, a correction, quickly. If retraction is needed, the notice must be clear about why. And we need systems to stop retracted papers from being cited or their data misused.
So it really is cradle to grave, designed along after publication. But they didn't say, okay, we've solved it, right? They identified future needs.
Definitely not. This is a foundation, not the final word. They highlighted lots of areas needing more research.
Like,
Things like, how effective is integrity training really? What makes patients more or less willing to consent to data sharing? What are the absolute minimum requirements for informed consent? What level of data auditing is actually needed? How can we better define the role of data integrity committees? What are the best ways to determine authorship fairly?
and improving the publication process itself.
Yeah, finding better peer review models, maybe automated checks for reporting guideline compliance, clear journal rules on sharing raw data, ways to test integrity after a paper is submitted, developing standard terms to avoid selective reporting bias.
Even how systematic reviews handle integrity issues.
Right. How can reviewers assess trial integrity when they only have the published paper? Or maybe how can they better access patient-level data for checks? Lots of open questions.
Okay, so summing up the document itself, strengths seem clear, rigorous process, broad input, comprehensive scope, patient involvement, transparency.
Absolutely. Those are major strengths.
What about limitations? They acknowledge some.
They did. One is simply that there's no single perfect definition of research integrity, even if we all grasp the concept. Using that snowball technique to find experts might potentially miss some perspectives, though they tried to be broad.
And it's still expert opinion at the end of the day.
Exactly. Even though it's informed by evidence reviews, it's ultimately a consensus based on expert judgment. And as we noted, not every single expert agreed 100% on every single point. There were nuances debated, like the exact role of data monitoring committees or specific statistical approaches.
And the Cairo location, does that matter?
Well, they address this indirectly by citing data showing the countries with the most retractions are actually the US, Japan, China. It emphasizes that integrity isn't a problem specific to one region, it's a global challenge.
So the location of the meeting doesn't limit the applicability.
Not at all. These principles are meant for all RCTs, everywhere, in any field.
So what's the goal then? If it's not a rigid rule book, how is it meant to be used?
It's intended as a foundation, A resource that organizations, universities, hospitals, funders, journals, regulators can use to develop their own specific manuals, standards, and policies.
Tailoring it to their context.
Exactly. And it highlights that everyone has a role to play: investigators, institutions, funders, editors. It needs collaboration and harmonization.
It's not just one group's responsibility.
No, it's a system issue. Improving integrity needs a mix of things. Training, yes, but also better governance. Maybe using technology for automated checks, improving research methods, and actually investing in the infrastructure needed to do good clinical research.
And coming back to that idea of errors,
Yeah, the document is realistic. Unintentional mistakes will happen. You can reduce them, but probably not eliminate them entirely in complex research.
so that culture shift is key.
Building that culture where honest errors can be admitted, learned from, without fear of retribution, that seems absolutely crucial for genuine, long-term improvement in research quality and trustworthiness.
It's moving beyond just policing.
Right, shifting from primarily hunting misconduct to proactively fostering an environment that supports and encourages responsible, high-quality science.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive today. We've looked at this major international effort, the Cairo Consensus, which really tried to pin down what integrity means for clinical trials day to day.
And resulted in 81 specific recommendations, built on evidence and expert agreement, covering that whole trial life cycle.
And understanding this stuff matters for you, listening, because it's about ensuring the research that impacts your health, your treatments, is actually reliable. It gives you a basis for understanding the standards that should be behind the health information you encounter.
It definitely empowers you as a user of that information.
Which leaves us with the final thought to chew on. If we accept that errors are inevitable, and we actually need researchers to feel safe admitting them so we can all learn, how does the scientific community make that cultural shift? How do we move from a system that often feels focused on catching wrongdoing to one that genuinely fosters open learning and continuous improvement?
Or maybe think about technology's role. We touched on automation. Could AI, for instance, become a major tool in enforcing some of these integrity checks, ensuring protocols are followed, data looks right? What are the upsides and what are the, potential downsides or risks of using AI to police the science that guides our health?
Really fascinating questions for where medical science might go next. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.